Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here is your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in the weekly nonprofit podcast series, People in Fundraising. It is 7 p.m. on a Thursday night here in Utah, and it is 11 a.m. the next day for my audience in the States and Canada on Friday, April 25th. And I'm so excited to welcome my first guest from Australia, Stephen Rowe. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning. You got all the timing just right as well. It does take a little bit of thinking, doesn't it?
A little bit. Well, thank you for joining us today. And what would you like to share about who you are with our audience first?
Well, fairly briefly, my position title, we always like to start with that, is the Senior Manager of Prospect Research and Briefing at the Australian National University. It's in a little place called Canberra, which most of your audience perhaps has not heard of. I'll be very impressed if they have. But we are quite similar to Washington, D.C. in some ways. So we are about halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, and we were set up partly because it was halfway between those big feuding cities many years ago. And so here we are. So I've been in this position since about 2012 and have really enjoyed it.
Excellent. I'm excited to hear about how you entered the field. You've also had a big role to play with Apra in Australia, so we'll get to that as well. I'm excited for you to tell our audience about that part of your career journey. So Stephen, what we always do with each guest, asking a first question, just tell our audience, please, in a few minutes, how you entered the fundraising profession, and if it goes by another name in Australia, New Zealand, the Asia Pacific region, I'd love to hear what that is.
Sure. The short answer is it is about the same.
Okay.
We'll maybe talk about the cultural differences a little bit later on, but how I got into it, I try not to say I fell into it, but I did fall into it because I applied for a job without really knowing what it was and got it. The slightly longer version of that is I like how you did use the word profession, because that has been an interesting learning for me over this time. But to go back to the beginning, I was doing my degree at university, like lots of people, not really knowing what I'm going to do with this arts, political science, development studies thing. And it eventually became reasonably clear that there would have to be a bit of postgraduate study if I really wanted to do it all properly, if I wanted to work in development aid or some other elements of civil society, community development, things like that, which was interesting enough. But that was not something in the end I really wanted to commit to. So after a short period of apple picking after university, just to go do something else for a little bit of a change, I stumbled across something, and this was back in the day. You probably could find a job in a newspaper, but this was online at least.
Okay.
Where there was research, there was analysis, there was writing, and that's what I was looking for at the time. That's all I really knew or perhaps understood about myself at the time, is that this is what I'd been doing for my degree. Here's something that's popped up at the University of Auckland, which is the largest city in New Zealand, which is where I'm originally from.
Oh, okay.
And I'll be very impressed if people can tell the difference between a New Zealander and Australian in conversation. I sort of have a mixture of accents. But this was way back in 2007. And they, for some reason, flew me up from Wellington, where I was at the time, and I went through a round of interviews and again sort of understood what was going on, but it was certainly not something I had any understanding of before in terms of professional fundraising organizations. And short version, they said, yes, come along. And I moved up there. And that was my first role as a prospect research analyst, if my memory serves. So from about 2007 until about early 2011, that's when I sort of all got into it. So there's a little bit more detail to it, I'm sure, but that's the shortish version.
Terrific. And at what point, Stephen, did you physically move from New Zealand to Australia? Because you're now, as you mentioned, at Australia National University.
Yeah. Well, like many New Zealanders, I had a look at that big country over the Tasman Sea there and saw an opportunity
Mm.
to do a similar job in a different place. And things sounded a bit more exciting over in Sydney, which is the city many will be a little bit more familiar with, at least for a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
And I was certainly in a position to do something a little bit different, which I did. I'd never been to Sydney before, but I jumped over in 2011 for
Okay.
what was a 1 year maternity cover at the time, but not having too many other responsibilities or things going on in my life. That's when I jumped over to Australia.
Okay.
And then that was the way I got to the Australian National University,
Yeah.
is through someone effectively offering me a role to start a prospect research operation
Oh, wow.
at the Australian National University. So it was a real big jump from Auckland, which was doing pretty well. They did a capital campaign way back then in the late 2000s, which was quite unique. But then jumping over to Sydney University was a whole other world, as it is for a lot of people coming from New Zealand going to Australia. Everything's a bit bigger and shinier and more exciting, and
Whoa.
it was a bit to get used to, but it was all very interesting.
Terrific. Terrific. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I'm curious to know, I did not know that you're originally from New Zealand. As a true prospect researcher, I do a little bit of research on each guest, and I tell them that, ahead of time, to help draft the questions.
Of course.
Um, so my next question, Stephen, that you got ahead of time is that this podcast and others, Jay Frost's Philanthropy Masterminds series, we have global audiences of nonprofit professionals, and they enjoy hearing about different practices, different parameters, whether that's government or civil society parameters on how you can operate as a nonprofit. To that end, what's the general attitude in Australia? If you want to talk about New Zealand, totally great as well, towards philanthropy. So, for example, do regular citizens look at philanthropy as more that the state, federal, local governments should be funding, and then individuals and corporations can, chip in? Or, what's kind of the mood there, please?
Sure. Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to slice that answer, and we'll get into a little bit of it, I'm sure. Look, the general perception is positive. It is something that everybody understands. Everyone understands that there are so many great causes out there, and a way to enhance those causes is through philanthropic support. It's the degree to which it is enmeshed in our culture that tends to be very different to North America. And this is something we go on and on and on about it, frankly. The differences between North America, usually the USA, sometimes the UK as well, which is just a part of the Anglosphere that we sometimes think about and talk about.
Yeah.
But we see North America as it's just on all the time. Everyone's doing philanthropy. Every rich person there is really doing it. They're thinking about it. They're expected to do it. That's often the one that we hear, is that if you're rich, however that's defined, people know what you're doing because you tell them what you're doing, and you're proud of it. You're expected to do it, so you're doing it. Yeah. Over in Australia, that's still coming. There are certainly a few reasonably well-known large philanthropists, but it's not as expected over here. And we could do a whole session on this, I'm sure, but the government, whether at the federal level, state level, local level, has certainly had a greater role in society in terms of supporting various parts of social services or the environment or health. But as we all probably know, some of these are just limitless in terms of the need there. And whether it is the cost of living over the last few years or anything else, there's always a need. One thing that does come to mind is the bushfires across what was called the Black Summer in Australia. This was just before COVID, so it was one of those things that might have been making the news there.
I remember that.
Yeah. And there were a couple of very high-profile pieces of fundraising done by some individuals that just blew up out of nowhere, and then they had far more money than they knew what to do with, which perhaps reflects the lack of preparedness in some cases. But yes, we went straight from that into COVID, so that was an interesting time. I should say maybe a little bit further. There certainly is, by many metrics, a lot more fundraising going on. There's so much room for it, whether we're looking at rich lists, as we sometimes do in our profession, and going, right, how much are they giving? Okay, there's a bit more to give there. But corporations are actually have noticeably been a really strong contributor in the growth around here. Again, there's a bit of room for it, but it probably, or I know it correlated to an extent with the Black Summer of 5 or 6 years ago, where there was a lot of corporations stepping up and doing more. Sometimes it's large foundations being set up and just growing larger and larger, but I can tell you there is so much more to be done, and that can be done. And we do look at North America, and we hire a lot of people from North America to do these roles as well. And maybe that's changing a little bit, but it certainly just reflects a depth of talent that's around. Not that it isn't here in Australia, but it is one that we look to quite a lot. And one last thing I'll say actually is when we do start talking about big fundraising campaigns, whether it's at a university level or other level, maybe we go off and hire some North Americans or some Brits or something like that. They often say here, they say, it won't work. It's different over there. It won't work. It's just different in Australia. And guess what? It's not. Maybe there's a bit more reluctance. Maybe people aren't as familiar with it. But if you stick to the overall fundamentals of just making sure that you're talking to the right people about the right stuff, you're asking the right questions, you're doing everything intelligently, yeah, guess what? It does work. So there's been a lot of success, especially again at the university level here to talk about. But that's my initial answer. I'm sure we could do a half hour on it, like I said. But how does that sound?
That sounds great. That was a very good answer and informative, for me and for our audience. So thank you. Stephen, I always, as guests are talking, I'm trying to, certainly be in the moment, listen to what the guest is saying, while also with maybe 25% of my brain, listen for specific words or phrases that can be a nice entree to the further conversations, questions. And you just mentioned the word talent, talking about, North American talent in Australia and fundraising. And I want to talk about the talent in Australia, and specifically you helping to set up Apra Australia and the talent on the ground on that continent, in that country. If you could please tell our audience how that came to be, maybe who you partnered with, when the chapter in Australia was launched. Anything about that would be really fascinating.
Yeah, there is quite a lot to unpack there. But it is absolutely true. I was happy to be one of the drivers and founding members of Apra Australia, which we've had to think about once or twice, but we're pretty sure specifically was set up in about 2017.
Okay.
But the journey from that is, in a way, comes from, again, looking at North America. And I was lucky enough to attend my first Apra International conference when I was in Auckland. I went over to Boston in 2009. I want to say it might not have been that exactly.
Okay.
And I came back from that being, in a way, reassured that, yes, this is a real thing that I do, because I didn't have a community of practitioners. And we certainly had a team. There were 2 or 3 or 2.5 of us at the University of Auckland. No one else really doing it in New Zealand at the time, but it was something I became very aware of after being in a conference hall with 1,000 other people, astonishingly. And so I think at one point when I came to the Australian National University, I complained, just to my boss and said, I wish there was a conference or something. Someone should do something about that. And as many good bosses do, they said, well, why don't we do that? I will support you. I will make sure we've got some time, some resources, some space. You just sign them up. I went, oh, okay, well, I guess I have to now. And so, so in about 2014, we managed to at least get about a dozen or so people in a room here in Canberra, just to do all the things that we do when we get together, and just sort of say, how many fundraisers have you got? How much money are you trying to raise? So what are your sources? And all of those lovely things. And we did just spend a whole day, a little bit unstructured, but it was a first go at what I called a forum at the time. I didn't want to call it a conference because I was so nervous. But that was the genesis of having an actual community of professionals. There's that word again, here in Australia. And so what that eventually led to, I won't go into every single detail, but was trying to build up a number of people who would be willing to create an organization. And we didn't say it has to be Apra. We considered a few other local or regional options, but it was almost obvious at the start, like if we want to do something properly, we should be an Apra chapter.
Yeah.
And so that we did continue with a couple of mini conferences, but we didn't become sort of branded, if you like, until about 2017. So I wish I had a list of names here, so I could make sure I thank everyone specifically. And while I was, I am often credited as the quote unquote founder, but I couldn't have done it without so many other people. And I did become the first president of Apra Australia for a few years, but there were so many people around at the time who helped make it feasible. And they know who they are. Many of them are still around, which is a great credit to them, as well as the notion that we are in a profession, that we do have careers in what we're doing. So that was the journey to that part, I think. So a bit of confidence from someone who just said, yes, you can. And that's really laid the foundation for a few other things, but it was something I was really happy to do. And it's a nice legacy to have, and it's something I've moved out of after a few years, but it's always so great to see them continuing. Whether it's through mentoring programs, which continue, something I've been able to keep doing. I've had 4 or 5 mentees now in my time. There's a conference, they're setting up webinars, they're trying to get those social meetups going as well, which is always a little bit tricky. But it's so great. I'm probably their biggest fan, and I seem to be the one who asks lots of questions at the AGMs. So I couldn't wish them any better, but it has provided a useful foundation for me and some other things too.
That's awesome. Thank you for telling us that history of Apra Australia. And yes, you've mentioned on, I believe, LinkedIn, if not, that's probably where I saw it. And you just mentioned now verbally, Stephen, that your role in helping to launch Apra Australia laid the foundation for other opportunities. And one of them you mentioned specifically was your work at Amnesty International. So what is the tie-in between Apra Australia and your volunteer leadership there to Amnesty, for example?
Sure. Well, they are obviously very different subject areas, but we often talk about transferable skills and experience and things like that. And so Amnesty had been one of the organizations or causes around human rights that I had an affinity with beforehand, when I think I was writing letters in a little group in Auckland at one point, and then had been involved sporadically, but got back into it in Canberra at some point there. And I guess I would say that someone saw a little bit of enthusiasm and a little bit of, I guess you'd say, inclination to plan and organize people when it came to the group that was there. And what I have found, like in so many organizations, is that there is so much, I guess, need for other people to be involved as leaders. Yeah. And when they asked me, and they asked me many times to come onto the organizing committee in the region, it took a few goes, but I was happy to do it in the end, because I knew that I'd had some experience organizing basically enthusiastic volunteers through Apra Apra Australia, where we had a committee of 5 or 6, I want to say, for a few years. Okay. And if you have a bunch of people who are basically on the same page and want to do the same things, and hopefully you've got the right people who all get on well with each other, which we absolutely did. No, I was so happy to have that. It did give me the confidence that I could do that at a completely different organization,
Yeah.
but in a very similar manner. And I think I was on as a committee member, trying to, I guess you'd say, manage or liaise with other volunteers around the region, because
Okay.
that's so important, again, to have a community of people
Sure.
who know that they're part of something, especially coming out of COVID as we were at the time.
Yeah.
And so after reluctantly coming onto the committee, I then reluctantly became the regional president when there was an opening. there was an opening there, because what would happen if no one was the regional president? I guess I've been a president of something before, I'll have a go. And yeah, there was some familiarity, at least with the organization from there. It'd be very hard to come in cold. But that's what gave me the confidence. So yeah, going all the way back to that little conference in Canberra, you can start building on things by expanding your comfort zone. That's
Yeah.
something I've learned about here and there, is you don't want to, jump out of your comfort zone so much that you're drowning. But if you're a little bit uncomfortable, but you've got a bit of energy and enthusiasm and organizational ability, I guess I'd say,
Yeah.
that's what's led to it. So I've now been the regional president here in the Australian Capital Territory, as it's called, or kind of like DC again over in Washington there, as well as the wider region, for a bit over a couple of years, I think. I'd have to check my LinkedIn. But yeah, it's very different in terms of the subject material, but ultimately it's a bunch of organized and enthusiastic volunteers who all have their own issues that you have to be aware of, because we're all working, day jobs, and you can't have the same expectations necessarily. But as long as everyone's managing those and communicating with each other, and we know what we're working towards, I think hopefully most of the time things can work out pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to key in on something you mentioned there, Stephen, about, comfort zones. And I think you really articulated it well, that you don't want to be so far out that you're drowning, as you said, but to be a little uncomfortable, to kind of stretch your skills, maybe stretch some of how you manage your time and energy, I think is really key to sort of, a voyage of self-discovery. Be like, oh yeah, like I've experienced putting together a committee in this atmosphere, and now I can take it, and as you did with Amnesty International, just stretching yourself sort of incrementally and seeing where that goes. I got a methodical approach, so thank you.
Yeah, being able to do it all sustainably is also the key, as I've found in the area of human rights. It's basically limitless. You could do this as a full-time job, and just knowing where to stop and knowing where to rely on other people. Often people have been doing it a lot longer than I have and know a lot more than I do about a lot more things. But it's a real privilege to work with them, and hopefully keep everyone on track and not burned out, and just healthy and happy enough, and carrying on. Yeah. So it's an important notion. When I learned at it's an organization called Outward Bound, which I forget if that exists in North America or not. Yeah, something I did roughly a decade ago, just about pushing you. So there's a bit more in you sometimes, but also knowing when to stop on some occasions.
Sure. Yeah. So speaking of other initiatives you have pursued, I'm curious to learn what you feel like sharing about your work with Pyro.Solutions and its work in gift capacities for nonprofits. And is this an extension of what you do, professionally in your day job? Is it something like a startup, or whatever you want to share, please?
Sure. Well, Pyro.Solutions is a startup, and I don't know when you stop becoming a startup, because some startups are worth $1 billion, as we all know. But it is a reasonably small operation based in the UK at this point, and it is, I guess, something you might call a side hustle for me. But it does start with that notion of being in a profession again, and I'll tell you why. I think in terms of what we do in the day-to-day, or what we might call down here the nitty-gritty of just getting into the detail, we're trying to estimate assets and income and capacity and all that sort of fun stuff. And it often struck me as a little strange that in some ways we weren't able to do that, or the rules of thumb we sometimes used had no particular origin or
Okay.
turned out to come from a slide at a case conference in 2009 in Tallahassee or something like that. In particular, when it came to the largest sources of wealth in the world, which is company valuations. The richest people in the world, they own companies. And I'm not going to turn this into a complete sales pitch, but the way I ended up in this role is that I saw the work of Jason Briggs, who is someone who's been in similar roles to us and has now moved over into the world of consulting and startup and working in all sorts of ways that go beyond prospect development. But he'd done this great little piece called 5 Years of Reflection, which I somehow picked up on LinkedIn, which just had, it is exactly what it sounds like. It just had a few lessons there that he'd published 5 to 10 years ago at least, which I just found really interesting as someone who's interested in just doing better. He had lots of reflections on, just managing your time, or making sure that you kept a bit of information about your own successes, or how much time you'd spend on things, and how to work with fundraisers in some respect. All these things, which right now I probably now reflect onto my mentees and things like that, but I found terrifically interesting. And I basically just said, "Hi, Jason, love to talk more."
Oh, yeah.
And that was a journey to bringing him and his business partner, John Jeffries, on board, who had more of a specialist financial background in academia as well as the private sector. And they were working through themselves the myths, if you like, of income, company valuations, things like that. And then we eventually arranged for them to come over and do a Apra Australia presentation, just a webinar, one of those things. And it was really interesting to hear in the end how we're really not doing things in the way that we should. And in a way, it was more about, here are the myths. We didn't necessarily have the fixes at the time, but saying something like, "Oh, how do you value a company? I just look at the revenue and then that's the value." That's not how that's done. It is absolutely not how it's done. That's not the worst way of doing things, but in the real world, that's not how it's done. What if they're a software company? What if they work in biotech? What if they're a retailer? What if they're this? What if they're that?
Yeah.
And that's translated into the creation of a tool called Code FI, and that stands for financial intelligence, but we usually just end up calling it Code, which is kind of like a Swiss Army knife, if you like. So it's an analytical tool which has been created, and it's been part of my role to help promote that here in Australia. So that's a little bit of what I do, and I try to consult and give a little bit of advice here and there. But that's for John and Jason to run the company as they see fit, and they do more than just create this tool. It's been an immense amount of work, but it is ultimately a company that's also about education and training. They make specialist knowledge available, sometimes through small conferences. They have some other tools that are coming out in the UK as well. But again, it comes to the professionalism side of things. I didn't feel good that we did not have the capability here, and then to say, here's how we got to this, here's how we think this 10% stake of this company is worth $1 billion. We, as one of my colleagues once put it, we just throw a bunch of old bones on the fire and see what comes up. If I had to explain that to a fundraiser, I would not feel good about it. They're not always that interested in the methodology, but I like to be able to say, here's why this is our methodology. Here's why we use 3% of this and 5% of this. And it was a real credibility gap for me. And so it's something I believe in as well, but it also has very practical uses. And this is all part of the sales pitch. But in terms of just making that part of our job much easier, because a lot of the analytical work has been done for us through this tool, where they have lots of coders and people are thinking about information all the time and benchmarking information about income and valuations and how much companies have sold for and all sorts of other great stuff that's on there. But we're a profession, and I would like to be able to say that we have a rigorous basis for everything that we do. And so this has been, I believe, a real help in that respect. So it is a startup and continues to be. It has Josh Burkholz from BWF in an advisory role on there, which is a name I just thought I'd name drop because people recognize it. He's someone I've seen speak at Apra international conferences before as well.
Awesome.
A guy who really knows his stuff, and it was great to see that he'd come on board in an advisory capacity as well. So it's a really interesting area, and there's so much that goes into it. But I've been so happy to be involved with them for since about mid 2022 now. So
Okay.
the last thing I should say is that it does work across the US and the UK and Australia and Asia,
Awesome.
because as long as you can find the information that's particular to that geography, you can still do it. So it's not about having a warehouse full of names or a warehouse full of researchers as some companies do have, and that's been a great resource and something that I'm familiar with too. But it's like having a scientific calculator or a Swiss Army knife, if you like, to help us ultimately just help us do our job better and quicker.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a good point at the end there. Doing your job quicker, better. I think the word I keep hearing a lot, at least in the States, is efficiencies. How can we work smarter, not necessarily harder? How do we work more efficiently? Because I was on a Apra Swaro, the Southwest United States chapter, monthly call today as a presenter, and one of the people there said, do you sense that the corporate culture, at least in the States, of working, constantly is creeping into nonprofit, at least here in the States. And so how do we combat that? Because nonprofit is obviously not corporate culture, but there is that sense of work more. And maybe that's just, an American mindset that's really seeped in over time. But how can we work more efficiently? And so I think how you were talking about Pyro.Solutions, that's great.
Yeah. I think it's very hard to get away from without, resources are limited, and you have bosses and managers who are often doing their best with what they've got.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't always make decisions you agree with, or sometimes they do make great decisions, but sometimes that decision is, sorry, you're not getting any more resources, or you're losing it. Just find some efficiencies. I'm sure you can. Or here's our campaign target. We haven't really thought about it, but could you find us 1,000 prospects tomorrow? Those kind of things do happen, but we should always be thinking about efficiencies. Why should we do things the same way we've always done them? And there are so many more things we can be doing, especially as partners, if you like, or we like to think of ourselves often as strategic partners to fundraisers. And should we be spending half of our day trying to figure out every last bit of someone's capacity? Arguably no, or arguably yes, sometimes, because it is worth it to try and figure it out. But sometimes there are definitely quicker ways of doing it. And that frees us up to do all sorts of other really interesting stuff, I think. And that's a whole other conversation, but I'm pretty sure it's at the Apra International Conference every year in one way or another. And it's something I'm always very interested in too.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, Stephen, we have about 5-7 minutes left. And I put this last question in the survey because I do like to get a sense of who the person is, not just the professional side. And for you, I have a document that has about 200 questions, a master document. And then as I'm looking at the guest, I'm picking and choosing, moving things around. And I know that, about a decade ago, you took a sabbatical, as we'd call it in the States, and you did a lot of traveling. And I'd love to hear, about that, how that helped shape who you are. And in relation to that extensive traveling you did, the quote I want to share first is from a Harvard Business Review article in 2018, that social science studies have, quote, shown that international experiences can enhance creativity, reduce intergroup bias, and promote career success, and that exposure to novel cultural values can prompt people to repeatedly engage with what they feel like are their own, hard and fast values and beliefs. And as they get exposed to different cultures and ways of thinking about the world, that person can, add to their belief system, discard some of their beliefs. And so I just would love to hear, how did that time of travel for you? And it was over half a year of traveling, if I remember right. How did that, change you, shape who you are, please?
Yeah, it was an interesting one. I hadn't really thought of because the motivation was just go have fun for 6 months. Let me be clear. Because for some reason my work at the time said, yes, you can have 6 months of unpaid leave or else you'll probably quit. And I didn't confirm that, but I took it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was about 6 months, and it was an unbelievable thing that I was able to do, and it's something I still think about from time to time. But
Sure.
to try and answer your question, I I was, I should say, I was a tourist. I did not experience any culture in great depth because you're getting through there, you're seeing and doing the fun things,
Yeah.
maybe seeing some things that you don't expect to see, especially as you go through other areas that have far different cultures or societies. I did start in North America and then went through a little bit of Europe, and then as I worked my way through places like Turkey or India or Cambodia, that's where things got quite different in many ways, as you might expect. But I think for so many people, the world is a really dangerous place, if you like, or it's too different and it's almost not worth even trying. And I am a naturally optimistic guy. I think that's generally healthy until you get,
Sure.
unreasonably optimistic, and then you need someone else to pull you down just a little bit. But among other things, it probably just sort of it was able to say how welcoming the world and how good so many people are.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everybody's heard about someone who's traveled around and ended up in the back blocks of Kyrgyzstan or something like that, and they were fed and treated so well. But I really was so often, and sometimes treated as a sort of quite exotic novelty.
Oh,
As physically perhaps I was, as a very tall blonde white guy wandering around northern India at some point, and
okay.
getting a lot of people wanting to take selfies with me for some reason, which was just strange. But ultimately, ultimately there weren't too many profound experiences, but it was knowing how welcoming people are, and something I probably didn't bring on consciously, but at least knowing that I can talk and engage with so many other cultures, whether within Australia or in other travels elsewhere. It's not always going to go smoothly, but it will almost certainly go far better than you think. And so that's something I guess I would say to many people, whether they've traveled or not, or they've not quite thought about that comfort zone. Perhaps you don't always want to go too crazy with it,
Right.
but yeah, there's a lot of good out there. And then you do have to keep on your toes. And for someone who didn't mind doing a bit of research here and there,
Yeah.
that was reasonably natural. And so there were a couple of places where you just had to be aware of some things.
Mm. Yeah.
But I think that does continue to an extent, is just knowing that you're generally welcome. Maybe you have to have a bit of an idea of what you're getting into first. But Australia is actually a nation shaped by immigration in so many ways. There are far more here as a proportion than a lot of countries around the world, and
Oh, interesting.
it's without getting too much into the statistics there, but
Yeah.
something that we perhaps naturally engage with within Australia. But
Yeah.
knowing that you are so often welcome is just, I feel like I've made this point about 4 times. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's better than you think is
Yeah.
probably what I would say. So that's a nice it's a nice feeling to have.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think you're right that, um, it, you know, we're more connected. I mean, you and I are talking right now, and live,
Yeah.
halfway around the world in different time zones. The ease of being connected to people has radically improved. And yet, I think you're right. I do sense that more people, and even my own social circle, are like, yeah, I don't really know if I want to travel to Mexico right now, or I don't know if, and I'm hearing in the news right now, like, Canadians don't feel welcomed traveling to the United
Sure.
States. I think it's just really unfortunate that, we can be more connected in some ways and yet being pulled apart by forces sometimes beyond our own control in other ways. But inherently, as you mentioned, there's just a lot of good out there. So I appreciate that note.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something you hear about again. Sometimes you talk about governments, and then you talk about the people as completely different things.
Totally.
And anecdotally, you can get that just about anywhere. Turn up in some of these places, yeah, maybe you don't want to be there in the first place because of the way it's run, but
Yeah.
when you are there, there are so many lovely experiences just based on basic human connection, I think.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I just got one last question. Will you be traveling to Apra PD in Baltimore this summer? Well, it's summer in the States. Let's say August.
Yeah, yeah. No, I won't be this
Okay.
year. And
Uh,
I did actually make it to Baltimore several years ago.
okay.
So in a way, I was almost disappointed because I want to go to somewhere different in America that I've never really heard of or wouldn't go to otherwise. No, I won't be, and in part that's because I've taken a redundancy from the Australian National University. So in a couple of months,
Okay.
I will be out of here.
Okay.
But it is something I would strongly recommend if you can make it, and it's been a crazy privilege. I've made it to 4 or 5 of these conferences now. But the reality right now is that at some institutions in Australia, they're having a little bit of financial trouble, and the reality is I've had 17 or 18 great years in this profession where I didn't think I'd be in it for 10. I remember laughing in someone's face, perhaps at an Apra International conference, when they said, I've been doing this for 10 years. I went, what? That's crazy. Oh, that won't be me. And it's been so good for me in so many different ways.
Yeah.
No, I won't be. I may still be in the profession in one way or another, but I
Sure.
won't be doing it at the Australian National University. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens, and it's a lovely opportunity to reset and reflect in some ways, I'm sure. And then, as I am a bit of an optimist, we'll see what comes up. But I've got great hopes.
Awesome. Well, I wish you all the best, Stephen, and whatever comes next for you. And perhaps, someday at some other conference, some other setting, our paths will cross in real life.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'm just reflecting on 18 years. I have so many people to thank, and I can't possibly thank them all. So I'm always not trying. But if they are listening to this, I've probably had something to do with them and run into them in one way or another. And I'll give one little special shout out to my first ever vice president, who was Edwina Kenrick at the University of Melbourne. You may want to bring her on for an interview at some point. She'll have a lot of great things to say, but she's been a great support over the time as well. And so many other people to shout out, but that's for another podcast perhaps. So thank you again for the time.
My pleasure, Stephen. Thank you for your time. And for our audience, as we wrap up here, you'll be able to find Stephen's conversation across various platforms when it goes live, probably in July. I had a little bit of a burnout on my podcast back in March, so I took some weeks off from posting,
Gotcha.
and now I've got a pipeline of guests to air. But Stephen's conversation, like all the other ones, will be aired on LinkedIn with the link to the YouTube audio and video portion. The audio only on Spotify and Podbean. And then thanks to my 100th guest, Luis Diaz, of the Donor Participation Project, who's sponsoring the new website. You can find Stephen's conversation at peopleinfundraising.wordifysites.com. And Stephen, thank you again for your time. You've been a great guest, and I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Love the chat too. Thank you.
Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.